Hi, welcome to the screencast. This is going to be as quick as I can make it, just hitting the highlights of tissues. Should be more straightforward than cells or chemistry. So, fair amount of terminology, but not a lot of new complicated concepts. First thing to get down is that there are 4 tissue types in the human body. Anything that you pull out of a person is either epithelia, connective tissue, muscle, or nerve. This chapter is going to be primarily epithelia, and connective tissue. Muscles and nerves are going to get their own chapter. So we're going to start with epithelia. First thing to know is that they line all the surfaces of the body. So your skin, your gastrointestinal tract, your lungs, your urogenital tract, the inside of your heart, the inside of your blood vessels. If it's a surface, it's lined by an epithelium. All the epithelia have these characteristics. This is not an open-ended question, so you just want to be familiar with what each of these 6 things means. So polarity simply means that the bottom of the cell is different from the top of the cell. So here you have a row of cells. You can see all the purple nuclei lined up there. That is one layer of cells sitting on top of some connective tissue. The top layer of an epithelium, which is always bordering an empty space, is called the apical surface. And then the bottom layer is called the basal surface. And the basal surface is always glued to whatever the epithelium is covering. Specialized contacts we're not going to worry about. We already talked about tight junctions and desmosomes, so just know that from chapter 3. Here, avascular means there are no blood vessels found in epithelia. So like the epidermis of your skin is just cells, no blood vessels. Below the epidermis is some connective tissue that has blood vessels in it. So the cells of your skin are actually nourished by whatever leaks out of the blood vessels in the lower level of the skin called the dermis. So here you have, this is the lining of the intestine, and here's your epithelium, and then underneath it, connective tissue. So no blood vessels, but there are nerve endings that extend into your epithelia, including the epidermis of your skin. All epithelia are supported by connective tissue, which we will get to later in the chapter, and we will name the specific kind of connective tissue you find under epithelia. So just to reinforce that, here's your epithelium, and then all of this more loosely organized tissue is connective tissue. Do not worry about this term, basement membrane. We will talk about that when we do skin, because we'll talk about the basement membrane underneath your epidermis. But in order to get through chapter 4 quicker, I have cut basement membrane out of the chapter. And then epithelia, you can imagine, because they cover all of your surfaces, they are going to take damage. There's going to be friction and abrasion and heat and all of that stuff. So epithelia have to be able to be regenerated, or they are easily regenerated. So again, think skin. We cut our skin a lot. Cells are constantly dying and flaking off of it, and it's always replacing itself. So when it comes to naming the epithelia, we're going to go over the naming strategy, but you won't have to understand it and apply it. I just want you to know where the terms come from. So if an epithelium is 1 layer thick, we call it simple. If it is 2 or more cell layers thick, we call it stratified. Then epithelia can either be squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. If it's flat, it's squamous. If it's roughly square shaped, it's cuboidal. And if it's taller than it is wide, it is columnar. So we're going to have simple squamous, stratified squamous, simple cuboidal. We're actually not going to do stratified cuboidal, and we're not going to do stratified columnar. When we get into the epithelia, For each one, I will point out what is most important to remember. And I've actually gone through and highlighted most of the important stuff. Some epithelia we're going to know more for their function, some more for their location. I have selected sort of whatever makes that epithelia special, or whatever is different about that epithelium. So we start with simple squamous epithelia, which we saw in lab last week, I believe. So it is a single layer of squished flat cells. It looks like this here in the lungs. So these are the alveoli, or the air sacs of the lungs. That is that is the example I want you to know for where you find simple squamous epithelia in the body. They show up other places, but this is what we've seen in lab. So air sacs of the lungs is what I'm going to ask you. And because the cells are flat, it's really easy for materials to diffuse through them. So we're going to think of simple squamous epithelia as being good for allowing stuff to diffuse through the cells. Then we get to simple cuboidal epithelium. All you want to know about this is that it is found in the tubules of your kidneys and small glands. So this would be like salivary glands and parts of your sweat glands. So here is one of the tubes in your kidney, and this layer of cells right here on either side of that tubule is your simple cuboidal epithelium. I'm not going to describe it for you. I'm not going to ask you its function, because we're going to have other cell types that also do secretion and absorption. For simple columnar epithelium, all I want you to know is that this is what you find in your digestive tract. So stomach, large intestine, small intestine, primarily bordered by a simple columnar epithelium. So this is what the intestine looks like at low magnification, like maybe the 4x objective. And this layer here that I'm tracing is the epithelium. And then if you zoom in on it, it looks like this. So it's this layer, this layer of cells right here, one cell layer thick columnar. All of this stuff here, the more loosely organized looking tissue, that's connective tissue. So yeah, that's it. Simple columnar epithelium, digestive tract. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium, trachea or upper respiratory tract, like bronchi and some of your bronchioles. This is called pseudostratified because it looks stratified, but it's not. So this is what it looks like in the trachea. And then if you zoom in on this part right here, it looks like this. And you're just going to have to take my word for it that this is one layer of cells. So like if you look over here, you can see that here's a nucleus, and there's one that's above that, and this one is above that. But all of the cells connect to the bottom and extend to the top. They just kind of get twisted around each other. So it looks stratified, but it's not. So we call it pseudostratified. Again, that's going to be trachea. Stratified squamous epithelium, you do want to know both the function and some examples. So this here and this is both skin. This is thick skin. This is thin skin. We will look at these next week, I believe, in lab. So the function of a stratified squamous epithelia is to protect the tissue underneath it. You have several cell layers deep, so you can scratch the top and then the tissue underneath it is still intact. So that, again, esophagus and skin are the two I would ask you about. It's also in the vagina, but we're not going to cover that until we get to anatomy and physiology too. Last but not least is transitional epithelium. It is called transitional because it can transition from this appearance here and then stretch out and look squished or flatter. I don't have a picture of it looking squished, but because it stretches, it is placed in the bladder, or you see it in the bladder, and that's all you want to know about transitional. I'm not going to ask you to know that there are dome-shaped cells on top. Just know transitional epithelium stretches and you find it in the bladder. Then, oh, whoops, I thought we were on to connective tissue already. We're not. You can find two different types of epithelia. Covering epithelia, as this says here, so this is like your skin or membranes, like this right here would be a covering epithelium. And then glandular epithelia would be like sweat glands, salivary glands, sweat, salivary, digestive glands, that sort of thing. So exocrine and endocrine are terms you are going to want to know. We are going to cover them both in lab and in lecture, so they'll come up in lecture again. I think it's easier to do exocrine first. In an exocrine gland, you have a duct that the secretion or excretion gets excreted into, and then those ducts are going to lead outside the body. So your sweat glands are exocrine glands, and your salivary and digestive glands are also exocrine because the contents of your digestive tract ultimately end up exiting the body. So because your digestive tract is open to the world at both ends, your digestive glands, like salivary glands, are considered exocrine. An endocrine gland is ductless. There is no tube or pore into which the secretion is secreted. It is simply released by the cells of the gland and then makes its way into the bloodstream. So your hormones are all secreted by endocrine glands. So these are tissues that just make hormones, secrete them outside the cell, and then they get picked up by the bloodstream. Now we are on to connective tissue. And I think I can go more than 15 minutes, so I'm going to try and keep going. We'll see what happens. Connective tissue is, as this says right here, all connective tissues meet the definition of cells suspended in an extracellular matrix. The matrix itself is outside of cells. It is non-living tissue. And it is going to be composed of a ground substance and protein fibers. So the protein fibers, along with the cells, will be suspended in the ground substance. Just to give you sort of an analogy for epithelia versus connective tissue, if you're looking at this thing here, this is all blocks, very little space in between them. That is what you want to think of as an epithelia being. It's just all cells stacked one on top of another with very small spaces in between them. Over here, this like concrete, I don't know, formica looking thing, this is like connective tissue. So you want to think everything that's brown or black or white, all those little flecks would be cells, and then all the gray stuff would be the extracellular matrix. So you have living cells suspended in a non-living matrix. The other analogy I use for connective tissue is like a wasp's nest, where it's the gray papery kind of nest. The wasps inside it are alive. The nest is not, but the nest is made up of material that the wasps secreted. So living wasps in a non-living nest. Here, for connective tissue, we are going to have living cells in a non-living extracellular matrix. If we go back to this slide here, you can see that the ground substance might be fluid, or it might be something as hard as minerals. So, oops, sorry, wrong direction. This is blood. Blood qualifies as a connective tissue because you have your red and your white blood cells suspended in a liquid ground substance, which is plasma. So the extracellular matrix of your blood would be the plasma and then any proteins floating around in the plasma. Bone also qualifies as a connective tissue. All of these little things here that look like little hairy spiders Those are all osteocytes. All of the grayish white stuff is the bone matrix itself. So you have osteocytes suspended in a mineralized or calcified matrix. Connective tissues are going to have a whole bunch of different functions. You can imagine any category of tissue that includes both blood and bone is going to do a lot of different things. So don't worry about committing to memory what connective tissues in general do, because they're all so different. There are just two characteristics that all the connective tissues have in common. One is that they are all cells suspended in an extracellular matrix. And two is that they all start out during embryonic development as a type of tissue called mesenchyme. So this is what mesenchyme looks like under the microscope. And so whether it's blood or bone or ligaments or the dermis of your skin, in embryonic development, they all start out looking like this, and then this mesenchyme receives different developmental signals and develops into all the different kinds of connective tissue. So we put them all in the same category, not just because they meet that physical description, but because they all originate from the same embryonic tissue type. And then this slide we're not going to worry about. Some of them are vascular, some of them not so much, some of them have nerves, some of them not so much, some of them you can regenerate, some of them, like tendons and ligaments, not so much. So don't worry about this slide. All right, what do we want to know? For the different types of fibers, the predominant fiber protein that we're going to see in connective tissues is collagen. This is one of the primary architectural, tough, supporting fibers that your body uses in connective tissues. Reticular fibers are also made out of collagen, so they're molded from the same protein, but they're spun out or drawn out in thinner fibers, and they form little networks like meshworks for cells to attach to. And then elastic fibers are just for elasticity. For this slide, I have crossed out the stuff that I never ask questions about on the exam. So in many of your connective tissues, you are going to see fibroblasts. That is where all the fibers come from. And some of them are going to have macrophages. These are white blood cells that endocytose bacteria, viruses, or if you damage something, they're going to clean up all the cellular debris and damaged bits. So these two terms here, or their endings, blast and site, I just want you to be familiar with so that you recognize that going forward. If a cell is a blast, like a fibroblast or an osteoblast, this is a cell that is either producing material, like fibers, or dividing and adding to a connective tissue by just adding to the total number of cells. And anytime you see a cell that ends in site, which I don't have any of them listed here, like chondrocyte or osteocyte, these are mature cells that are no longer dividing. They're just playing a more stable physiological role in the tissue. All right, whoops, why am I, there we go, we're advancing. So again, with the connective tissues, we're going to run through them pretty quickly. And for each one, I will just point out what I want you to know about it. You don't need to know description, location, and function for each one because that's too much information. So we are starting with areolar connective tissue. As this says here, it's not in the OpenStax book, which is a pretty big omission because it is one of the most common types of connective tissue. You find it throughout the body supporting all of your epithelia. So there's a little bit of areolar connective tissue under the epidermis of your skin. All of this stuff here in the GI tract is areolar connective tissue. And when you find areolar connective tissue in a mucous membrane, like your respiratory tract, urogenital tract, or digestive tract, we call it lamina propria. So this is a term that's going to show up again, and that is just one form that areolar connective tissue takes. Adipose tissue, this is pretty straightforward. I didn't highlight anything, but just know that you find it under the skin and sort of tucked into lots of different places in the body. It is used in some places for cushioning, in some places for thermal insulation, and in other places, well, everywhere it is energy storage. Reticular connective tissue, I'm not going to spend much time on because we're not going to see it again till Anatomy and Physiology 2. All of this black stuff that looks kind of like a spider web, like this meshwork of fibers, those are the reticular fibers. Reticular fibers form a scaffolding that cells can attach to, and you find reticular tissue in organs that filter fluids, like your lymphatic organs, your tonsils, and your spleen. But not in your kidneys. Your kidneys do a different kind of filtering. Then dense regular connective tissue. This you want to know is for your tendons and ligaments. And this top part here is the dense regular. It is lots of parallel, tightly packed collagen fibers. Dense irregular also has a lot of collagen fibers, but now, like if you look over here, they're all running in different directions. So dense regular connective tissue is like a cable or a rope that can resist being stretched in one direction or another. Dense irregular connective tissue is more like a grocery bag or a cargo net. It contains lots of things. So here, the example I have shown is the dermis of the skin. It also forms the capsules of your joints. But dermis of the skin is what we're going to see in lab this semester. And then elastic tissue is just elastic. There's also cartilage, 3 different types of cartilage, which is a connective tissue, but we're going to cover that when we do the skeleton. So that's it for chapter 4, relatively straightforward. So the old chapter 4 has serous membranes and mucous membranes on it. We're not covering those this semester. They won't be on the exam. Don't worry about them.